Our final presentation is titled Threats from the Periphery, the Challenge of Terrorists, Smugglers, and Pirates in Southeast Asia's Border Regions. And our presenter is Justin Hastings, who is at Georgia Tech and is a political geographer working on a whole variety of topics at the intersection between geography and politics, including proliferation networks, terrorism, insurgents, the geography of clandestine transnational organizations, a whole potpourri of fascinating topics. Justin?
Thank you. So initially this paper was actually in a different panel, which is about illicit networks in general, but that panel was canceled, so I decided to focus my remarks mostly on piracy instead of just general illicit networks. And so what I'm interested in specifically here, taking a slightly different tack from the previous two papers, is to talk about the links between terrorism and piracy, right? And sort of how we can think about those links and what that means for Southeast Asia's security. And I have a slightly different take than I think many people have talked about in the past. Right, so immediately after 9/11, there is this concern among many people, especially in Singapore, which is sort of strategically located in Southeast Asia, that pirates and terrorists might cooperate, right? And the idea here would be that terrorists would somehow get pirates' help in carrying out some kind of attack. I think this is sort of largely gone by the wayside because we haven't seen a lot of evidence of this. So then we sort of move to this new idea, which is that terrorists and pirates are going to have similar tactics. They're going to have similar strategies. And so terrorists might, in fact, take the resources and attack at sea as a way of crippling the economy by blocking sea lanes or by engaging in sort of LNG, taking over an LNG ship and then running it into a harbor or something like that. But again, I mean, sort of the number of maritime terrorism incidents we've seen is low enough that we can actually recount them in narrative form in many books, which is indicative that it's not simply the majority of terrorist attacks. So what I want to do is think about, instead of the incidents of piracy or terrorism, I want to think about what goes into those incidents. What is the background for sort of acts of piracy or terrorism? And specifically, I'm interested in prior conditions, right? Sort of the networks that it takes to carry out a piracy hijacking or the networks that it takes to carry out a terrorist incident. And so the reason you think about this is when you think about a piracy hijacking, it's actually surprisingly complicated, right? Especially when you're trying to sell the ship. Right, you attack a ship, that's actually pretty easy. But then you have to have a buyer for the ship. Right? You have to be able to disguise the ship at times. You have to be able to re-register it at times. You have to be able to offload the cargo and then sell the cargo. All the people who either don't ask questions or don't care. Right? And to find the buyers in the network for that requires a fairly sophisticated social and trade network. And so what I'm interested in are these sort of social and trade networks that exist across borders in Southeast Asia. And one of the interesting things about Southeast Asia is that it's a region which is fairly highly integrated in terms of communications and transportation infrastructure, but is separated by these borders that in some cases were pretty arbitrarily drawn by the colonial powers in the 19th century. And so what you see is a lot of sort of transnational social and trade networks that are set up to facilitate legitimate trade and legitimate social interaction. And they operate across these borders, which have more or less sort of topography that may be more or less difficult for states to control. But what's interesting about these groups is that they can be turned to illicit activities. I mean, you can have formal trade that's facilitated by these networks, but you can also have illicit activities. These illicit networks can engage in smuggling. They can provide the networks or the infrastructure necessary to carry out pirate attacks or smuggling attacks. And so the question is, where does terrorism come in? And I would argue, instead of thinking about terrorists as being connected to pirates by tactics or even by cooperation, we can think about them as using the same illicit networks in these border areas that pirates and smugglers do, and using the same routes to move people and weapons around a region that pirates and smugglers use to move ships and move smuggled goods. And you can see this if you sort of look at a map of Southeast Asia. Right? So this is a map of piracy hijackings in Southeast Asia between 2000 and 2007. This is not all of them, but it's all the ones that I could actually track. Right? And you can see, obviously, they're clustered around sea lines of communication. These are the mid-level Jamaat Islamiyah units that were in existence between about 1999 and 2001. Right? Some of them were sort of mainly notional, but the ones that I'm most interested in were actually in existence. And so what you do is when you look at the places in Southeast Asia where Jamaat Islamiyah's Wakala-level units and pirate attacks overlap geographically, you can see that, in fact, there are a number of these areas, almost all of which are on some kind of border. Right? And when you think about sort of what goes on in these border areas, you can see that they have characteristics and social networks across these borders that enable illicit activities to take place. Right? And so I'll give you an example of this. This is Batam. It is an island immediately south of Singapore. It has many sketchy areas part of it, and this is one of those sketchy ports. And I visited in 2005 to talk to both smugglers and police officers who deal with smuggling in Batam. And so one of the interesting things about Batam is because of its proximity to Singapore, there are in fact legitimate trade networks and social networks that exist across Batam, Singapore, and southern Malaysia. Right? It also has many, many islands where sort of pirates and smugglers can hide. In addition, because Batam is something of a free trade zone, its infrastructure relative to much of the rest of Indonesia is quite good. Right? And its port infrastructure especially is not bad for an island of its size. And so what this leads to is essentially a concentration of illicit networks in Batam that then are able to carry out illicit activities of all kinds. Right? And so you think about sort of the illicit networks in Batam, they basically have carried out any kind of illicit activity you could think of has been there. Right? Sort of allegations that GAM, the Free Aceh movement, actually sold marijuana in Batam to raise money when it was in existence. Certainly there's a lot of smugglers in Batam. Pirates have sort of set sail from Batam to attack ships, as well as taken ships that have been hijacked back to Batam to disguise them. And Jemaah Islamiyah does not have a cell there, but they had a cell in Singapore and in Johor Bahru, which they would then second people from those cells to Batam to carry out attacks there. Right? And they use actually, in some cases, the exactly same routes as the smugglers did. And so what's interesting here from a sort of security standpoint is, when I was in Batam, I was talking to a police officer, and I asked him, do you know where the rat ports are, the smuggling ports in Batam? In Indonesian, it's known as the Pelabuhan and Tikus. Right? And he said, not only do you know where they are, we know that there are 64 of them, and here's a map showing all their locations. Right? And some of the locations were actually adjacent to naval bases in Batam. Right? And I said, well, logically, why don't you stop them? Right? And he said, because then the people will get angry at us for denying them DVDs and cheap televisions. Right? And so when you talk sort of more, what you get out of this is that these networks that have been sort of turned to illicit means are actually providing daily goods for the population. They get cooking oil from the smuggling networks. They get rice from the smuggling networks. Right? And in some sense, they are legitimate precisely because they are based on these legitimate social networks. Right? And so when you say we want to stop smuggling, you run into a problem because it turns out that illicit activities and economic development or economic activity are actually interconnected. Right? And if you crack down on the illicit networks, you're going to harm in some ways the economic livelihoods of much of the population. Right? At the same time, if you encourage certain kinds of economic development by building infrastructure and things like that, without a sort of commensurate increase in the ability to deal with these informal networks, it leads to actually the illicit activities being easier to carry out. Right? In my sort of research on sort of logistics of terrorism, JI and other terrorist groups prefer better infrastructure. They don't like going through the jungle. Right? And so when you are sort of improving the economic status of a border region, what you're really doing is enabling many of these groups to operate more efficiently than they would have otherwise. Right? And so what that means is when we think about counterterrorism, we have to be very careful how we operate in these areas, precisely because this can have negative consequences in areas we didn't really expect before, right, in terms of the sort of the backlash from the local population. Right? It also means at the same time that these groups are dependent on these networks. Right? And because they're dependent on these networks, if you can find a way to formalize and regularize these networks in a way that doesn't increase transaction costs, you could probably do a great deal of damage to the operations of many terrorist groups in Southeast Asia. Right? So that's all I have, and I'd be glad to take questions.
Thanks, Justin.